Welcome to a special live episode of the DS Show. We're here at the Fox Studios in Los Angeles. I'm your host, Daanish Soomar, and I'm joined by a very special guest, Mr. Darrell Cross, EVP of Finance at Fox Entertainment Studios. Welcome to the show, Darrell.
Oh, thank you. Good to be here.
As we kind of dive in, we're going to have a great conversation on many different areas. I think first and foremost, we can dive into your career journey. So do you want to introduce yourself to the audience?
Originally came down to Los Angeles from Eugene and was in the accounting profession for a little bit, and then moved into technology out of public accounting, working in wireless location, a couple different companies, one of them Signal and Communications and another Technicom. Found a deep desire for not only technology but entertainment, and so found an opportunity as I got out of graduate school, the public company at the time, Ascent Media, that did a little bit of both. The entertainment industry was going through a big transformation from film to digital, and then, the earthquake in Japan of 2008 moved it from tape to digital even faster. So that was kind of how I got exposed to entertainment, because I found when I was in entertainment companies, I was looking at the technology of what was happening in the world, and then when I was at technology companies, I was always tracking the top box office, the top TV shows, the top music. So the blend of those two made it very interesting to me, and so that was the beginning of my entertainment career. And since then, I've been in a few different entertainment companies. I spent about 10 years at Ascent and Deluxe. We sold to Deluxe 2010 and moved into marketing with a theatrical advertising company that also had a branded content company through a partnership with Ridley Scott, and joined MarVista back in 2017, and I've been here since, so going on 8 years.
Yeah, so, recently MarVista got acquired by Fox.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about what life was like pre-acquisition and post-acquisition?
Yeah, pre-acquisition, I came into a company that was, very successful. Fernando had already built this company up, probably been about 15 years by the time I joined them, primarily as a distributor initially, and then they got into the production environment, doing a few different movies at a time that were tailor-made for some key clients. By the time I joined them in 2017, they were doing about 25 to 30 films a year, still acquiring a fair number of films. From there, we kind of looked to expand the funding capacity, so we opened up bigger lines, started to fund more films, really kind of was looking for some opportunities until COVID hit. And at COVID hit, we were one of the few companies that was still able to produce content. I still remember we were sitting in our Wilshire offices in beginning of March, and we said we were going to work remote for a week. For that first week, we were on calls every day with the production teams. Everyone was finding their production sets were all being closed down, and they all had backups, and they were, on their 5th and 6th, and we just called the ball on March 14th and stop. Production's just going to go down. So we stopped production, but we were one of the first to get back into production in June of 2020. And we still finished 40 films in 2020. And that was what kind of put us on a lot of people's radar. We were already a fairly well-known company in our space for TV, movies, and distribution, but that started deeper relationships with the Lifetimes, deeper relationships with Tubi, who we started and did 3 films with. Then we did 12 films very quickly. We were in some previous discussions with another potential acquirer that we just couldn't get to the right terms. And then Tubi said, Fox is looking to acquire stuff. Would you guys be interested? And so we had our investment banker contact and start discussions, and so we leveraged a lot of the diligence and stuff we had done, and that was probably this time 4 years ago, March 2021, and from then we just got into the diligence and closed in December of 2021. So,
what do you think it is about MarVista that kept you guys afloat during the pandemic? Is there some special quality or traits that you would point to about the company that?
Yeah, I would think it's the company culture. We struggled a lot with a number of different things. Fernando has been big on making sure that the company culture of how we show up is important to how we perform. The two are very interrelated, and so he realized that if we're going to ask the most of people in these difficult times, this is not the time to be cutting salaries, doing certain things, even with different recommendations from myself of the concerns of the viability, not knowing what the future is going to look like. But we stuck to it, and it worked out. We had some of our best years during those really challenging COVID times, because I think the focus that we didn't have any distractions. There were some benefits to the cost structure. We used to send people on set for a number of films, and we weren't doing that at all because travel was impossible. And so we picked up some savings there. We implemented a lot of those things on a go-forward basis as well. But there was just a lot of opportunities that we were able to take advantage of, and some luck as well. You're always lucky in most things. So
Fascinating. Now, you mentioned the acquisition. Can you talk a little bit about what it's like going through an acquisition? Is it something you guys have to keep under wraps? Like, how does it work from a day-to-day as the evaluation is kind of ongoing? Like, how does it look kind of from end to end?
Yeah, it starts with a very small group of people, always me, Tony, Fernando, this like the key, executive team, and then it spokes out from there as needed. Mainly because it's, you don't want to create too much anxiety of like excitement that may not happen. You really want people to be able to trust the information they're getting, and so we don't want to kind of get their hopes too high or let they, bring them down too quickly, which is one of the reasons. And also, you don't want rumors spreading around. But I'd say for the first 2 or 3 months, it's a very tight-knit group of people. You're trying to get confirmatory guidance of like, if these things are true, you're looking to go forwards before you start opening up all of the diligence and everything, because it's a fairly detailed process which takes a lot of effort. And so for the last 3 or 4 months, it was me and Tony and Fernando doing a ton of the diligence with the help of then the finance team, who would, other people came in under the tent at that point and had an idea, because you start to have these requests and you're like, why are we pulling this together? And you have to keep it to a very small group of people. But it's one of those things that for most finance and even operations people, it's a nice feather in the hat of your career. It's a big project, a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of sleepless hours. But it's like, I guess the comparison would be climbing Everest. It may not be fun in the process, but when you get to the top and you get over the finish line, it feels pretty amazing.
Yeah, because you just did that thing.
Yes,
right?
It's a big accomplishment. And Fox has a very detailed diligence process. I still remember when we had our celebration dinner for the acquisition, the head of corporate development, Justin, who's become a really big asset for us, was very surprised to learn that our diligence team was me and Tony.
Wow.
With the amount of output we were getting done. But I think part of that was also our systems and some of the stuff we do that we were able to leverage, because we had systems and in place and processes in place that Fox didn't even have at that time, because they had sold off all their systems to Disney and were rebuilding. And so that was an added benefit that came along with the deal. They were impressed by the systems. They didn't think they were going to leverage them, and they ended up kind of leveraging them. So.
Now, how long did that acquisition take end to end?
March, closed December, so about 9 months.
9 months?
It was about 9 months from the initial discussions.
Yeah. And what does kind of post-acquisition life look like for things to kind of settle down and transition?
It's been great. I think it all depends on different companies and how they manage those type of processes. Some companies have a very strict process of getting companies onboarded, moving onto their systems, a quick plan of those things. I think Fox, because of where they were and that we were a fully functioned business unit who had a finance, accounting, everything built out already, they kind of left us out there and worked closely with Fox Entertainment, but we weren't integrated right away because they had made other acquisitions who didn't have the TMZs. Tubi was a fully formed acquisition as well with a full team and everything, but Tubi and there was a couple others that are escaping me right now, where they were part of larger companies who got a lot of support, and when they came over, they needed support here of HR, finance, legal, a lot of those things. So as they were getting those integrated, they left us to kind of do what we did and just report in the numbers, and then we've really become fully integrated over the past probably 18 months, which has been great. Okay. So
how much of the acquisition would you say is driven by the product mix you guys had versus the talent and like the surrounding operations and G&A that kind of surrounded MarVista?
I think the initial interest was more the talent and the business we had. I should say not the talent, but the business we had. And then as they got into the diligence, that portion of the talent, the processes, workflows, systems became kind of an added benefit, which became of higher value as we moved through that. I mean, at the end of the day, I would still say it was a lot about the business and our capabilities. Sure. They didn't really have any production entities here, and I think the goal was to hopefully figure out how we could leverage what we do on a bigger stage.
Okay. Now, how would you say your day has changed from your day-to-day standpoint, pre and post acquisition, now that you're EVP at Fox? How does your day look different compared to what it was like before? Much
broader, many more business units, also have a lot more assets, a really great team that was already over here that we've become part of. So those guys have been fantastic to work with, not only because they're extremely capable, but their historical knowledge of Fox in general, which is helpful. So those teams coming together has been a big asset. But the day-to-day, I've lost some of the things that dealing with banks, dealing with external auditors, we're just part of a business unit that's part of a bigger entity that's doing a lot of those things. But overall, it's been good. Some of those things I enjoyed, some of those things I found a burden. The win is that they're really great people here, and it's a broader suite of companies that we work with. So it's a lot more of the financial modeling, a lot more that we're in the budget process right now and the long-range planning process. So there's many more companies to get familiar with, understand what that trajectory looks like, understand what that market looks like, because even though we're all in entertainment, different pieces of entertainment, adult animation versus unscripted versus scripted versus daily shows like TMZ and stuff. So there's a number of different things that impact that.
And that's a great segue for kind of where we're going next here. So when you look at the entertainment industry, there's kind of a general perception of risk when it comes to greenlighting certain content. How would you say the industry's evolved from greenlighting riskier content versus maybe taking safer bet?
Yeah, so that we've actually went probably, as the industry has with the proliferation of platforms and the proliferation of content, everyone's trying to find a seat, so to speak, and not everyone does with their content. When we were MarVista, before we became part of Fox, vast majority of our content, because of our size and the scope of our slate, we acquired it, we had probably 80 to 90% of our content was pre-sold in advance of us going into production. We were dealing with international clients and domestic clients, but they would sign on for development before we went into scripts. And so we kind of had, we knew that we were giving up some upside, but we had the for sure sale at least, so we were mitigating our downside. We then, as we built up that volume, started to take some shots downfield with what we call spec titles, where we're making a film and then taking it to the market with no known buyer at that time. Some interest, but no known buyer. We've had more of that in the Fox world. They've asked us to take a few more kind of opportunities down the field on those things. So we've went more into a larger risk profile for us. In a time right now that's even more challenging, is we're seeing a number of the platforms who may need content, but when Netflix got cash flow profitable in COVID, it put pressure on everyone else. Suddenly Disney starts turning off the spigot of development and production for a little bit to try and get cash flow profitable. And you see it at HBO, you see it at all these. So content market got a little bit more difficult domestically and internationally, and hopefully if what everyone says happens, some consolidation happens, there'll be a kind of a settling of the dust, and then people will go back to their normal buying patterns, which I think would be healthy for the market.
You mentioned about the aspects in taking the safe bets versus taking risks. How much of it, when it comes to the streaming platforms especially, is it more of a quantity game? Is it quality? What's kind of the balance between quantity and quality?
Well, I think especially with the streamers, it's been more kind of quality oriented. With their series and stuff, that's obviously somewhat quantity, but they're looking for a higher value series to kind of establish or bring in those new subscribers. And so I think that's where the focus has been for us. We have a few key series that we've been able to leverage. We've had The Way Home, which has been it's going into its fourth season, Chicken Sisters in its second season. We have a number of other series that we do for Fox, Going Dutch and Animal Control, and more in the pipeline. So I think our goal has been a little bit of both. So our remit is really to kind of super partner with the network to make sure that as a production entity, we're giving them everything they need, but then also maintaining our third-party business for the growth opportunities as the entertainment industry kind of rebounds.
Now, shifting gears a little bit, we talked a little bit about the acquisition, a little bit about content strategy, and just content generally in the industry. You mentioned a little bit about your team earlier and just the culture. Can you talk a little bit about what you look for when you're hiring talent on your team, and some of the leadership that you've surrounded yourself with? Like, what kind of went into staffing those roles, and what is it that you look for?
I think it's changed as I've gotten older and more experienced. I think we normally look for people who not only have an interest in what we're doing, just a general passion of it, but also kind of problem solving. I've realized I used to want people who had the specific skills and experience that we're looking for, and I found I can normally train people or teach people what I've learned over time, but I can't teach them to be problem solvers. They have to have a kind of an innate desire to tinker with stuff, to get curious and try to figure it out. And so I think those are really high quality individuals that you can kind of invest time in, that I think that we've kind of refine that over time. So we find people who want to be problem solvers, who want to be here, and when we get them here, we tell them that, especially MarVista used to be this way, and it's still the same at Fox, but it's bigger at Fox. Sit in meetings, connect those dots, understand before something ever hits your desk, what is it went through to get to you, and then when you do something to it, whatever it is, how does that impact where it goes downstream? And so the more you understand that, the bigger value you're going to add than just like kind of focused on what's coming across your desk. And so we always want people who want that natural curiosity, because if you tell people to do that, they'll kind of wander around. But if they really have interest, they'll go sit in a creative meeting for a little bit, which we allow all the time. Sit in a production meeting, sit in a distribution meeting. Then the synapses all begin to kind of fire and connect, and they realize it's all confusing for the first 2 months, but then all of a sudden it starts to come together. Then they're sitting in meetings where people are asking questions, and they're able to answer stuff. We've lost some people just out of the natural evolution who got a good opportunity somewhere else, and they're like, yeah, I was just sitting in the interview and I'm explaining everything, and they were so amazed by how much I understand. That's the benefit of that, and where they're going sometimes is a larger company where they're not going to have that big breadth of knowledge and experience. They're going to go super deep in a very specific area, which may be just as enjoyable, but it's different.
Well, it's nice because of the setup you guys have. All of these different departments seem to be more readily accessible, right? Whereas maybe at a bigger company, you're like 5 people removed from the next department, right? So.
Yes. And a lot of our business, we try to use the market knowledge. So it starts from the salespeople talking to the clients. We'll have our certain titles that they're talking, like, what about these titles? Do you have anything like this? And they come back to us and start feeding into us of like, well, it'd be great if we had more of this type of holiday title, or why aren't we doing any horror, things of this nature, that we start to then feed into our development pipeline. So it's kind of a very quick turnaround, because we're very fast. We can be a very fast turnaround of script to screen in 6 months. So
wow. Yeah, no, I like what you mentioned earlier too about you have your little bit of work, and if you're only focused on your little bit of work that's on your desk, you're never going to see the big picture, right? It's like seeing the forest for the trees, kind of.
Yes, it helps depending on wherever you want to move up in this organization. If you're going to get into modeling these things, you really have to understand not only what the development costs are, get an understanding of what participations and residuals look like. You may not have to be an expert, but you have to understand those and be able to ask the big questions, and then talk to distribution of what that means, and be able to kind of give some type of semblance of historically other titles like this have done X domestically and Y internationally, and have a general framework. And if you can only get that if you're interacting at a very high level on a very frequent basis with a number of those other departments. So it's a very interactive kind of role.
Nice. Now, if you put yourself in the shoes of somebody who's just coming out fresh out of school, or maybe they're a young professional looking to break into the industry, what advice would you give to them, and particularly within finance, let's just say?
When I speak to the interns and others over recent years, I always tell them to find something. They don't have to love it, but they have to like it, and that marries up with what they're good at. Everyone says go find something you love and it won't be work. I don't know if that necessarily is true in the long term, but I do believe that if you have a general talent in something or a skill, and it aligns in an area where you have an interest, those are always the best places, because you're going to figure out how to use your skill in something that you enjoy. There'll be aspects that aren't enjoyable, but you'll at least come back to the things you do enjoy, and there'll always be little pieces of projects that you really enjoyed spending the time in. That's where you put your effort, and kind of will also expand your mind of, oh, what if we could do this, and really take it a step further than maybe is even being requested, because you just have a general interest in it. So I always tell people to focus on that, as well as, and I always hate this question, but wherever you want to be in like 5 years, think about where you want to be. And then it's not a very direct path. I always think of it more like a triangle, and of all the different blocks you need to kind of check off to get to that top box. And so we've had a number of people who come in and want to work, for example, I want to work in financial planning and analysis. Well, we don't have an opportunity in financial planning and analysis, but we have one in participations. And I'm going to tell you, if you want to be a manager of FP&A, you're going to have to check off not only some FP&A work, you're going to check off some residuals, some participations, have a general understanding of accounting, then move up, so if you're just clicking off boxes you're going to have to get to anyway, what's it matter where you start as long as it's on the path? So
that's kind of more on the accounting and finance side, and kind of more of the technical route. But do you guys also vet for culture? Because you mentioned your culture is a big part of who you are. So what about like things like character, values? How
I think
of that is in the interview process.
For us, it's more about we explain how our culture is and make sure that it aligns with what they want out of a work environment, and even a personal environment, because half of what goes on is there's a lot of personal interaction on a regular basis. We use a program called Insights, which I just view as an ability to shortcut the inevitable relationship that'll be built if you were to work together for 5 years. If you work together for 5 years, you're going to go through some very difficult projects. You're going to go through some very challenging times, which bring you together as a team and understand the strengths of people, the things that help them work best. Little things that, if people work with me for like 3 years, they know, don't send Darrell a super long, detailed email. Give him the bullet points.
Summary.
Yeah. Summarize it for him. He just needs the high level, and he'll ask the questions. Those are just kind of shortcuts that happen with the program that I think help people. It just gives people a kind of a leg up to move quicker in those things.
What if you had to give HR folks a piece of advice, what would be your best advice you'd give them?
To not and I don't think they do, but to not underweight culture. Culture is one of the most important things that, and I've become a much bigger believer of this, largely due to my boss for many, many years, Fernando, who, consistently stuck with it, and then you see the values and the benefits of it. And so I would say that really is key, and it's better to stay consistent with your culture than a few other things, than anything else, a policy or something like that, because that culture is really kind of what becomes the backbone of a company and becomes what they're known for. So
when you reflect back on your career, are there kind of moments you look back to where you say, like, okay, this was a moment that led me to my next thing, or this was the moment that took me to the next level? Are there moments like that you can look back to, whether it's maybe having a mentor you had in a previous role, or even in your current role? Are there moments where you realize, like, okay, this was a big milestone?
Oh yeah, definitely. Part of it is just, again, luck. I'll talk to many different people. I've had very good bosses and mentors. I think maybe just happenstance to some degree. But, one of my first entertainment jobs was at Ascent Media, and I just happened to be there and developed a relationship with the CFO at the time. And I was very junior, but he was giving me certain things. And I just remember the CTO at the time had went to Paramount and Sony and sold them on this digital format where they were going to be servicing their libraries off of digital formats, which sounds so standard right now, but it was so Wild West at that point. I mean, they had things like the very first encode would be one price, the first transcode is this price, the 10th transcode will be different pricing for different versions, which was very hard to manage. And overnight, digitizing those libraries went from a zero business to north of $100 million business.
Wow.
And so it created a whole new arm within Ascent. And I just remember my boss at the time, who was the CFO, he's like, got a new job for you, Darrell. And I quickly became the head of finance of the digital arm there. And so that was one of those things where it's like, just because I was working closely with the CTO on those, I just ended up pairing up with him and becoming the head of that what became a fourth division there. And so that exposed me to a whole new area, which would have been radically different than if I became the head of film, for example, which was going in the opposite direction. I would have learned a lot there too, but it probably wouldn't have fueled my career going downstream. So
now, can you talk a little bit about that, kind of for somebody in finance, their career progression? Usually you kind of go from an analyst to a manager, maybe VP, eventually CFO. Can you talk a little bit about just kind of mentality shifts or kind of the mindset shifts that go into each of these roles and how you show up differently?
We talk about that all the time, and the first thing I would say is patience. And I think it's rampant. We talk about this with all different levels of the organization, but it's rampant in sports right now. If you're a big fan of college sports, if a freshman doesn't get started now in the transfer portal, they go to somewhere else, and maybe that's going to work out. And the kind of the equivalent I think of is through various booms of industries, people have come in, worked 18 months, moved to another job, 18 months, moved to another, but within 3 years they're now a director, and they may know a very specific set of skills that has helped them get to director, but they don't really have the broad-based experience that when a new problem comes, that they've dealt with those things. So I always view it more like they're on a pole instead of a mountain. They're at the same height, but the base underneath it is radically different. And so I always try and convince people to spend the time, because you're going to want to gain that experience. It's going to pay off at some point, and it's a much longer time frame. It's not where your competitors or your schoolmates are 3 years out of school. Where are they at 15 and 20 years? You're going to have 50 years of work to really kill it. You don't need to do it 3 years out of school. And so the more time you take early on, the more it's going to pay off later on, from what I've seen. So we always talk about that. And then more importantly, as you move through those ranks, the best advice I ever gotten, the thing that I always kind of restate to people is find your own voice. Everybody manages differently. You're going to learn a lot of things from a mentor, but my first mentor was, I would say, pretty intense guy, but I learned a ton from him. But I don't manage the way he managed. Right. I use a lot of the skills and experience I learned from him, but in my own way. And so I always tell people to find their voice. I'm a very direct person, which can work and not work in some certain instances. Yep. Jeff, who's my right-hand person, has a different path, and it balances me out, and it helps the overall team. And so everyone has to find their voice as a manager. You can learn a lot of things, but you need to kind of internalize it and not copycat it.
Now, we talked a little bit about Jeff. You mentioned Jeff, right? And he's been really big on some of the systems that you've been rolling out. Now, as an executive, we're kind of shifting gears here. What are some of the things you look for when evaluating systems, right? Do you really care what the system is? Do you when you're going through an evaluation, is there a checklist you're going through, or as an exec, are you just here, just give me the number?
No, I mean, there is a fair amount of a number that comes to it. What type of benefits are we going to see? What does this look like? How do you kind of think about total cost of ownership over some defined period of time? For us, when we were doing this, and we did a couple different installations, big changes. The first one was probably in 2017, 16, 17. We switched accounting systems. We were looking for an EPM, which we went with Anaplan. A number of those things that we had to look at, and what's the life of that we can see for this system based on what our trajectory is, and how does it help us manage what we have today. And we were running into the problem that we were increasing the volume every single year, and it was compounding on us, because even though you did 20 titles last year, those don't go away, they just go in the library. You still have to manage them on this individual film forecast, and we had this ungodly spreadsheet. And so that was one of the things we looked at was, okay, how does this help us, and does it help mitigate the need to kind of continue to add tons and tons of people? Because every time we added people, is like to get them acclimated and get them up to speed was difficult. And so those were the things we looked at, and the flexibility of the system and our ability to kind of customize it. Because I've always been through numerous system implementations, and there's a lot of complaining about the system, but what I've seen is it's rarely the system per se, it's the implementation of the system, and understanding either what the limitations are and those trade-offs of what's out of the box available versus what are we going to customize.
Right. I would say also, in addition to the implementation, paired with that is also the business process kind of underlying all of that too.
Which can be modified and it needs to be looked at in the same time. So
now, we talked a little bit about FP&A. How is it, what makes it unique in the entertainment industry versus, let's say, some other industry?
I was thinking about this. I would say the thing that I always find most interesting is that old joke about all the different sets of books in entertainment, because it's 100% accurate, but not in the negative way that everyone talks about. If anyone's ever worked in film or TV, you have 3 sets of books. You have what's called the Ultimates, which is like the individual film or TV show forecast for that over, let's say, some defined period of 7 or 10 years, whatever you choose your ultimate to be. That's what you think it's going to do. Then you have your actuals coming in, and then you actually have the cash related to it. Each one of those has a different set, and they're never in sync, especially as different things have come about. Amazon and Netflix were the first to do this, but we can sell a movie to Netflix, and let's say we said it's going to do $10 million over its 10 years, and it's going to make $1 million. That's our ultimate, let's say. In the actuals, we've now sold something to Netflix for $4 million. We still have another $6 million to go to achieve the ultimate if we can, but we've done pretty good. We went and sold it to Netflix, but they don't pay, here's $4 million on day one. They typically pay quarterly over the license. So now, if we have people who are participants or residuals that we have to pay on that, that's based on the cash as that quarterly payment comes in. So if you look at just those 3 sets of books, they don't look anything like one another, and the reconciliation between the 3 can be a real challenge. And so I think that's always one of the things to be able to look at is like, hey, how do we think we're going to do? How are we actually doing? But is it really that good? What have we actually collected? Because you spend all the money to make the move, and the real variance is when does it all come back in?
The cash flow.
And that was one of the things we focused on at MarVista. We had a metric of we needed to be cash flow positive in 18 months. From the time we started that film, 18 months later, it should have paid for the production of that film. It may not be profitable, but at least it's not negative, because we knew if we were negative more than that with the growth trajectory we had, we're funding too many years of slates. We're not only funding this year's, we're funding part of next year's, and we're even part of the third year's by the time, because you still haven't recouped the first year at one point.
You're just burning cash at that point.
Exactly. And we had a debt facility that was meant to fund that, and obviously with debt you need to kind of manage that, and so we kind of lived and died by that metric for us.
Right. So how much of, as an exec, what you're doing, you're looking at the accrual books, that may paint a pretty picture, but then on the cash side you're like, oh boy, their runway is
Yeah, the greatest advice I ever got with my first CFO position, I thought the person was insane, but then you realize that you have to, is to have a daily cash flow model, to know daily what's coming in, what's going out, and it all depends on the business. We really are, when I first got here, we were doing daily fundings. We went to kind of couple fundings per week for the productions. Yeah. One day we were paying AP, but cash is always coming in every day. And just being able to know week to week what that's going to look like. Is it as important for us in the Fox world as a division business unit? No, but we still do it. It was very important as a standalone business with a debt facility that you had to manage and that had caps and baskets and limits on it. And you had to report on that and know where you were going to end up, so you weren't surprised of like, oh my God, our borrowing base dropped and we're now exceeding the borrowing base. We could never have that. So you needed to have a good handle on that. And I just remember when someone told me a daily cash flow statement, I was like, that seems insane. How can you do the day? But the funny thing is, the more you think about it, the harder it is. But if you just start and lay it out, you'll start to see the patterns. And it's not perfect, but you begin to see, oh, this is why that one's wrong. So you start to tweak it and refine it. And within 3 months, you have a model that is like, it's pretty bad at first, but within 3 months, it's pretty accurate. And you can begin to really manage those things. So.
And how much of the modeling and systems help you inform from some of these decisions and
I live and die by it. That's what was that was the thing I loved. I think that's one of the things that we do well here. We had very detailed models that allowed us to understand if X happens, Y cash, Y Z debt, whatever. We had a very kind of detailed model, which was the basis of what we then built out in Anaplan quite a bit. My model, which may not have been the greatest architecture, so to speak, because it was put together for a number of reasons, but it became the basis, which I think, if nothing else, gave Jeff and Naomi very detailed understandings of a full set of financials, meaning you start with, we have a project coming in, what does that do to my P&L, what does that do to my balance sheet, what does that do to my cash flow? You could see it flow all the way through, and we really kind of built that out into Anaplan, which has been invaluable for us for all kind of forecasting and budgeting and stuff.
Right.
So,
and you can scale that up.
Yes, that's the big win. Excel didn't have that capability to scale up as much and to connect different modules against it. So
now you guys are currently going through your budgeting cycle.
Yeah.
Just in general, for budgeting cycles in entertainment, and just kind of based on what you've seen, what are some of the pitfalls you've seen FP&A teams kind of fall into when budgeting, forecasting, planning?
It all depends. It can be different things. I would say the one that I've seen the most often is that too dependent on the system or model or whatever. I love them, but when it spits out numbers, you need to be able to understand how you arrive there. And Jeff was just doing it yesterday. He's like, this is coming up with a huge negative on this, and I don't understand it. And so he started to look at it, and then he was able to walk it through. And it's like, okay, that it's a negative is not great. That you understand it is better. That now we know what's creating that, because I think too often, especially when numbers come out in a range that people thought, if they don't think about the details of how they got there and some comparison period to now, be able to walk it down, they just have too much reliance on those numbers. And as you're building out any of these things or anything you have going on, errors can happen. Underlying changes in the business, and we saw this all the time when we were building out a lot of our ultimates, underlying changes in the business suddenly created haywire calculations because when something has to back up, we didn't have the safety guard on that. So it would basically unwind something for us, and we okay, now we got to fix that calculation. But it had nothing to do with what we had built. It was just the underlying business. We had never seen that happen when we built that calculation or that formula, and then it helped us kind of supplement that. And so those are all the things that, as long as you understand what's going on in the business, then you can accept the numbers, but you got to be able to walk it through and understand it. So
as someone who's kind of there's kind of a technical aspect to the systems, and then you have folks who are more functional. I think Jeff always compliments you as you've got the great ability to kind of do a sniff test on the numbers, right? And you can kind of quickly see oh, that looks off. Go check that out, right?
Yeah.
Where does that kind of come from? Do you think it's just experience, and you can just kind of see okay, the system is spitting something out wrong? You just are all right.
Yeah, I mean, it is experience, but it's also if you ever had to build it. I was building those models in Excel, and I knew how things come out. And sometimes I'm wrong, but then it's more about that project was different than I thought. It's that's the right number. Oh, I didn't realize that we had that much, participation or whatever it was that it was breaking so early. But it just comes from building those things up and getting. That's always the nice thing about a budget cycle is we have a couple new finance people starting in some of our business units, and it's a struggle to come in the middle of a budget season because you're trying to put it together. You don't even really understand the business. You kind of understand how to budget, but not with these systems, and so it's really difficult. That said, it's the best way because once you get through that on the other side, if it's knowing 0 to 100 of a business, coming in through a budget, you can get to 70, 80 pretty quickly, which if you started right after the budget, to get there it'd probably take you 12 months because you just missed the budget, but in the budget cycle you can get there in a month or two because it requires a discussion about everything.
Yeah, and one of the things we see too is oftentimes customers will be so focused on doing the inputs and the calcs and the analysis where they don't have time to step back and actually focus on the strategy and the insights and what are you getting out of it.
Exactly.
You're too lost in the needle in the haystack kind of thing, right? And ultimately, are you making strategic decisions based on the work that you're doing?
I always explain that to all the people who always tell me that you're the finance guy, it's your budget. And I'm like, the budget is the derivative, right? It's the outcome of everything else you're telling me. I'm not coming up with the budget. I'm taking what you're telling me with the business and what we think we're going to do. This is just the numerical outcome from our discussions. And so it's always funny that it connects that for them. I'm like, I'm not putting together the budget. You are. I'm just turning it into numbers. So when they talk about whatever this number of series or we want to do this number of movies, we think we have this opportunity internationally, we're just quantifying it. So it's I can't put together a budget without that strategic input, otherwise no numbers come.
All right, well, it's been a great conversation. We've gotten to cover so many different aspects, talking about the acquisition, different topics within content strategy, a little bit about FP&A and systems. Is there any last words you'd like to leave the audience with? Maybe a piece of advice, anyone looking to break in? Maybe it's just kind of generally wisdom you've garnered over the years?
Yeah, I would just always say, wherever you go, you want to be curious and get outside of your own department. We always try and partner all of our finance and accounting people with some of the operators, even the accounting people, because things are going to come to them in an imperfect fashion, and you can either help the person up in front of you who's sending it to you and understand their problems, or just kind of deal with it. But either way, you need to kind of develop those relationships and figure out where your next steps are. So it's always about making sure you have a level of curiosity outside of your own kind of direct realm. So
Darrell, it's been a pleasure.
yeah, great. Thanks, Daanish.
All right.